Okay, we'll welcome everybody to Sunday school class today. We are, let's see. So today we are going to talk about, actually we have, in Come Follow Me, we have 2 weeks. We did Doctrine and Covenants sections 14 through 17 this last week. And then this coming week, we're doing Doctrine and Covenants sections 18 and 19. And they're full of interesting things. The 14 through 16, of course, are specific revelations given to the 3 Whitmer brothers, who are, very important in church history. And there's really interesting things in the messages that were given personally to them. It's also a lot of material. So for our lesson today, I've decided to focus instead on section 18, which is the one we're going to be reading this coming week. And there's a reason why I'm sort of, if you will, jumping ahead. It's because I have a Come Follow Me study suggestion that's relevant to this coming week's readings, which we'll get to later in the lesson. Again, just a couple of procedural things. The meeting is being recorded. Again, I'm going to make a presentation, but we're going to try to leave time, lots of time at the end so that people can have questions and comments. So if you would like to make a comment or have a question, want to discuss something, there's a raise hand function in the Zoom. And there's also, you can put a message in the chat, and our Sunday school president, David Bentz, is monitoring all that. And so we'll be sure to try to get to everybody as we get to that point in the lesson. So the theme of the lesson that I'd like to discuss, focusing on Doctrine and Covenants section 18, is the question of what is the church? Yeah, see, I have church there in scare quotes. So, whoops, okay, now. So there are, a couple different things that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints could be. Now, you're probably all familiar with, and we'll actually read a reference to this when we get to Doctrine and Covenants section 22, I think. To the original formation of the church on April 6th, 1830, when, as you may recall from the church history, 6 men were gathered at the Whitmer home in Fayette, New York, and formally organized the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or it was originally just called the Church of Christ. So is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints a New York not-for-profit religious corporation? And the answer is no. The answer is no, because they didn't finish the process. Church historians have scoured the records of New York State and the counties around Fayette, because under the New York statute and force at the time, you could form a not-profit religious corporation, but you had to file a certificate with the county clerk or the Secretary of State of New York. And New York's records from that era are fairly complete. And they have been scoured by church history researchers, and no one has ever been able to find a certificate of incorporation for the Church of Christ from that time. So the conclusion is that either they didn't understand that they had to, all the steps they had to go through to create a nonprofit religious corporation under New York state law, or because of the turmoil and all the stuff that was going on in the church in 1830, they just didn't get around to filing the certificate in the county clerk's office. So it's not the New York not-for-profit religious corporation. Now, there's an organization called, later when the Saints got to Utah, they realized that they did need to have some kind of corporate organization. So the Corporation of the First Presidency was formed as a Utah not-for-profit corporation. And the question, is that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? Now, it's true that the Corporation of the First Presidency does have title to all the church's properties. It's the organization has the bank accounts and so on and so forth. But that's not what we think of usually when we think of what the church is. The church is something much more than a corporation with some bank accounts and some real estate. I think, or at least that's, I think, what the view of members of the church would be. So what is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? So there's a third possibility, and that is that it is the organized priesthood of God on earth. And that is what the Doctrine and Covenants suggests. So let's illustrate this by asking this question. And so what is Russell Nelson's official title? We usually refer to him as the prophet with a capital P, or the president of the church. But actually, Doctrine and Covenants, section 107, gives us the official actual title that's held by the person who is the president of the church. And you'll see here that it provides in section 107 that there should be one appointed to preside over the church. He shall be the president of the high priest of the church, or in other words, the presiding high priest over the high priesthood of the church. That's Russell Nelson's official scriptural title of the position that he holds. So we can see here that what the church is the priesthood. And the leadership of the church is the leadership of the church because they preside over the priesthood, according to the Doctrine and Covenants. So now let's go back to the parts of the early Doctrine and Covenants where we've been reading. And there's a number of sections here. Back in section 13, which we looked at a couple of weeks ago, this is where the Aaronic priesthood was conferred on Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery by John the Baptist. And this is the actual words that he gave. And he tells them that the Aaronic priesthood holds the keys of the ministering of angels and of the gospel of repentance and so forth. And then in section 18, we have these verses. In 4, he says, all things are concerning the foundation of the church, my salvation and my rock. And he shall build up my church on the foundation of my gospel, my rock, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against you. And then later in verse 17 in section 18, again, he uses this reference to the gospel being my rock and my salvation. Now, these phrases here clearly evoke for us the and so let me, make this next point. And if you go on in section 18, one of the main subjects of section 18 is this is where we first hear about the 12 apostles, the calling of the 12 apostles. And so in these verses that I've excerpted here in 18, they talk about, for the first time in the Doctrine and Covenants, calling 12 apostles, ordaining 12 apostles, and the responsibilities the 12 apostles will have, which included ordaining other holders of the priesthood, baptizing, giving the Holy Ghost. And then down in verses 37 and to 39, it's that Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer are designated to find, select, and ordain these 12 apostles. Now later, Martin Harris was added to the group, so it was the 3 main witnesses to the Book of Mormon, Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, and Martin Harris, who were assigned to select and organize the first quorum of the 12. So anyway, all of this is evokes the famous verses from Matthew chapter 16, the incident where Simon declares that Christ is the living God. And then in 18 and 19, Christ says unto Peter, I say unto thee, thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. The gates of hell shall not prevail against it, and I will give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. So clearly, this is what is being evoked in the verses we just looked at from sections 13 and 18 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Okay, so, we're familiar with this. So why is this significant? Why do we make a point of looking at these particular phrases? Well, we do that because we need to put these revelations in the context of the times in which they occurred. Matthew 16, verses 18 and 19 were the foundation of the papacy. That was the verses that the Catholics pointed to say this is the point at which Christ made Peter the first pope. So here's the papal coat of arms, and you notice that the prominently figures keys, and that's because the papacy is based on those verses from the Gospel of Matthew, where Christ says that he's going to give Peter the keys. So why was this? Okay, so why are we talking about this in the context of these revelations which were received in 1830? Well, I think that's important, all this background is useful because in 1830, the early saints were living in the context of a very Protestant world, and that Protestant world was intensely anti-Catholic, intensely anti-Catholic. So these verses from Matthew Protestants hated them because they were the ones that the Catholics used to justify the primacy of the Bishop of Rome. And especially the early members of the church were heirs of this intensely anti-Catholic, anti-Papist Protestant tradition. Joseph Smith had ancestors who came over on the Mayflower. I mean, and here's an old illustration of the Pilgrims arriving at Plymouth Rock. There's the guy standing on top of Plymouth Rock. And so, Joseph Smith and the early Pilgrims and the early New England Protestants, the reason, we all hear they came to America to get religious freedom. Well, what they were getting religious freedom from was other Protestants. Other Protestants weren't Protestant enough for these people. And so that's why they came to America, to be really, really Protestant and really, really, really free of any taint of Catholicism in their religion. These are the people that Joseph Smith came from. As I said, he had ancestors who came over on the Mayflower. So for Joseph to have revelations which evoked all of this Catholic scripture, rocks, keys, the gates of hell, and especially the idea of there being apostles, because of course the Catholic argument is that they use the term apostolic succession. The Pope is supposed to be the direct apostolic successor to the first of the apostles, or the presiding apostle, St. Peter. So this idea of having a quorum of 12 apostles is absolutely not Protestant. Now, that's okay in 2021, as people, Latter-day Saints, we don't consider ourselves to be Protestants, and we're not probably disturbed by that. But in the context of 1830, this was very radical stuff that Joseph was being revealed that evoked all of these Catholic concepts of there being the necessity of apostolic authority and keys in the church. So that's what I think is very interesting about these sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, is here we see the beginnings, or the real beginnings, of the establishment of the priesthood as being the essence of the restored church. Now, before I move on here, we need to address a question, which is, who has the restored priesthood? And this, of course, is, I'm bringing this up now because probably perhaps half of the attendees here are saying, wait a minute, I thought this was a Sunday school class, not priesthood meeting. Why are they talking about all this priesthood stuff? So I think it's important to make the point here that priesthood is important, that women are important in priesthood as well. So I have a couple of quotes here, one from President Oakes. These are both statements that were made in recent general conferences. President Oakes points out that we are not accustomed to speaking of women having the authority of the priesthood in their church callings. He says, but what other authority can it be? Any sister who is performing a church calling is performing a priesthood function. So therefore, whoever functions in an office or calling received from one who holds or exercises priesthood keys exercises priesthood authority in performing her or his assigned duties. And then President Ballard, also in a general conference, made another point, which should, it's people who've been to the temple will know what he's talking about here. When men and women go to the temple, they are both endowed with power, which is priesthood power. Access to the power and the blessings of the priesthood is available to all of God's children. So now this is a big topic that, you can quickly get into speculation about. And this is a gospel doctrine class. So for right now, I'll just stick with these two statements from the current president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and the current acting president of the Quorum of Apostles. But just thought this is important to point out here so everyone would see, or hopefully to convince everybody that the rest of the lesson is relevant to them. Okay, so I'm going to now make a suggestion for how we can study this whole concept of priesthood. It's kind of abstract. There's, some basic doctrines, and so you kind of say, okay, so the Melchizedek priesthood does this, the Aaronic priesthood does that, and it's the power to act in the name of God, and kind of what more is there to say? So this is just a study idea of how to kind of personalize this whole sometimes abstract idea of priesthood authority. And that is to study our own individual priesthood lines of authority. Now, many of you are familiar with this. Brethren, at least in older times, when they would ordain somebody to priesthood, they hand them this little card that gives the priesthood line of authority. Now, of course, you can get it on the internet, or you go to the church website and you have to send an email, but they'll send it to you. I got mine in like one day. This is the apostolic succession. Catholics have the claim of apostolic succession through all of the popes, but we have our own apostolic succession whereby every priesthood holder in the church can trace the line of his priesthood authority to all the way back to the beginning of the church. So I'm just going to illustrate this because by going through my own. The thing is, in the church, we do family history, and it's, we're encouraged not only, it's not just a matter of a bunch of dates and names, but, it's good when you're doing family history to kind of learn about your ancestors and hear some of their stories. And so I'm going to suggest that we can do the same with a priesthood line of authority. So I'm going to illustrate that by looking at my own here real quickly. So I was ordained a high priest in 1981 when I was called to the High Council by my father. He was his dad. I'm James William Lucas. He's William James Lucas. They wanted to name me after my father, but didn't want me to be a junior. So I got they switched the names around. So my father was ordained to be a high priest in 1965, when he was called to be in the bishopric of the Plainview Ward, which is, some of you may be familiar, it's out on Long Island. It's still in existence. It's there's a Plainview stake that covers most of Long Island. And there he is on the left, a little bit younger picture than that first one. So he was ordained a high priest by George Stanley McAllister. Now, this dapper fellow, George Stanley McAllister, ordained my father because Long Island was part of the New York stake at the time, our stake. And George McAllister, he went by G, he was G. Stanley McAllister, was the president of the stake at the time. Now, G. Stanley McAllister was a very interesting person. He had come to New York to run a chain of department stores. And the chain of department stores that he was the president of included until very recently, great chain of Lord & Taylor's. So he was quite a prominent businessman. And so when my father was called to the bishopric, the stake president at the time, G. Stanley McAllister, came and ordained him to be a high priest. However, there's a little bit of family story here, which I'll try to get through quickly so I don't bore everybody too much. Now, G. Stanley McAllister was not just another stake president of the New York stake. He was very significant because while he was president, he was stake president during the 1960s, was the time of the New York World's Fair. And so there was a New York World's Fair in 1964 and 1965. It was a huge production. Millions and millions of people came to the New York World's Fair in 1964 and 1965. And G. Stanley McAllister, the New York stake president, went to the church and said, this is a huge opportunity. There's going to be millions and millions of people come to this fair. We need to have a Mormon pavilion at the World's Fair. And he convinced the church to invest a very lot of money in building a pavilion at the New York World's Fair. And there's a picture of it. It was the steeples of the Salt Lake Temple. And then if you look on the right of the picture, you'll see there was the actual building was made with these big precast kind of modernistic looking concrete slabs. So you go through the doors of the Salt Lake Temple and then you'd be in this nice kind of modernistic looking pavilion. And the Mormon pavilion was very significant in broader church history because, for example, the film Man's Search for Happiness, which was a widely used missionary tool for decades and decades, was produced for the New York World's Fair Mormon Pavilion. And for our local church history, it was also significant. Many, many members of the church joined the church in the New York area. For example, the first Spanish-speaking members of the church were introduced to the church at the Mormon Pavilion. And then the first Spanish-speaking branch of the church was organized shortly after the World's Fair from all of the members who joined after being introduced to the church at the Mormon Pavilion. So all the dozens and dozens of Spanish wards that are in our Temple district, for example, basically all trace themselves back to this effort of creating the Mormon Pavilion at the New York World's Fair. So G. Stanley McAllister was instrumental in getting that to happen. After the World's Fair, those big concrete slabs were then carried out to Plainview on Long Island and were repurposed as a stake center. And this is why this is significant for my own personal family history, because when my father was called to the bishopric, he had been in his family was in the lumber business, so he knew a lot about construction. The bishop at the time was also a man in the construction business. And so this was a very significant thing for my father to be able to be engaged in the rather peculiar project of turning these weird concrete slabs into something that could be used as an LDS church. And it very much engaged him, and it greatly increased his commitment to the church, which is something that for my family is something that's very significant. And of course, the Plainview Long Island Stake Center, this building is there to this day, and a couple wards meet there, and one of the branches of the YSA stake also meets there. So this is a little illustration of what it looks like altogether, except that drawing is reversed. So anyway, okay, so let me quickly run through the rest of this. So G. Stanley McAllister was ordained a high priest by Marion George Romney, or Marion G. Romney, a name which may be familiar to the older of you. He was later a member of the Quorum of the 12 and was a counselor in the first presidency. Now, Marion George G. Romney was ordained a high priest in 1935 when he was called to be a bishop in Salt Lake. But again, Marion G. Romney wasn't just another bishop. This was 1935, of course, was the middle of the Depression. So as a newly called bishop in Salt Lake, large numbers of his ward were out of work. Later, he was called as a stake president, and his stake, 50% unemployment in his stake during the Depression in the 1930s. So as a bishop and stake president, he initiated the church welfare program as a local effort, and then it was adopted by the entire church from the efforts that young bishop and stake president Marion G. Romney had started in his local units in Salt Lake. So that's Marion G. Romney in the light colored coat with George Albert Smith and Harold B. Lee looking at the early Deseret Industries plant. So when I wrote a book about the United Orders many years ago, I found myself, Marion G. Romney had a lot of things to say about that, the relationship of church welfare and the United Order and so forth. And I quoted him extensively. So that's kind of, very, significant to me that he's also in my priesthood line of succession. Okay, we're going to rush through the rest of these folks. So Marion G. Romney was ordained a high priest by Joseph Fielding Smith, Jr., who was an apostle. Now, these days, it's probably fairly rare that an apostle ordains a high priest, but the church was smaller in the 1930s, and it was in Salt Lake. So Joseph Fielding Smith, Jr., of the Quorum of the 12, was the one who ordained Bishop Romney as a high priest. Joseph Fielding Smith, Jr. was ordained an apostle in 1910 by his father, Joseph Fielding Smith, Sr. Also, we know him as Joseph F. Smith. And both these brethren, of course, were significant in church history because they both served as presidents of the church. Joseph F. Smith from 1901 to 1918, and then Joseph Fielding Smith, Jr. during the 1970 to 1972. Now, Joseph Fielding Smith, or Joseph F. Smith, as he was known, was ordained an apostle in 1866. This is a picture of this dapper young man. We usually see pictures of Joseph F. Smith with the great, huge beard, but this dapper young man is Joseph F. Smith, probably around the time that he was called to be a member of the Quorum of the 12. And he was soon thereafter called to be a member of the First Presidency, and was in the First Presidency throughout the late 1800s until he became church president. And he was ordained an apostle by Brigham Young in 1866. And Brigham Young, of course, was ordained an apostle as part of the original Quorum of the 12 in 1835. 1835, I'm saying that right. Now, the first Quorum of 12 as we just indicated earlier, were selected and ordained by the three witnesses, Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, and Martin Harris. And they're pursuant to this revelation, section 18, and other revelations. And that's when the Quorum of the 12 began. Of course, they received this authorization through Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith was ordained by Peter, James, and John. We don't know the exact date and time that this occurred, that Joseph Smith and that's Oliver Cowdery with him were ordained as apostles, but it's referenced in a number of sections of the Doctrine and Covenants we're going to see. And of course, the Peter, James, and John received their authority from Christ. And at least according to Joseph Smith, this occurred during the Transfiguration, which is referenced in Matthew 17, right after Matthew 16, which is where it talks about how Christ tells Peter that he is going to give him the keys to the kingdom, which we believe refers to the priesthood authority. And so thus Peter, James, and John became the first presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ. So that's just a quick overview of some of these sections that we're going to see, and an idea for, a fun way to maybe personalize this idea of priesthood authority, which we can do by getting our priesthood lines of authority, and might make an interesting family home evening or just a study subject. And I would point out that this is something that the sisters can do too, because the priesthood line of authority, the person that confirmed you or baptized you, is just as relevant to your salvation as the priesthood line of authority of a man who has been ordained to an office in the priesthood. So we will stop the share there, jump back to David, and see if anybody has any questions or comments about this particular subject. And as I said, of course, there are this idea of going through a priesthood line of succession as a kind of way of personalizing this whole idea of priesthood and priesthood authority. If it doesn't work for this week, there are going to be a number of other sections of the Doctrine and Covenants that we're going to be studying this year that talk about the organization of the church and the priesthood. So it could be relevant to some future lesson if you're interested. So anyway, I just briefly leave you my testimony that I believe that the church does have the priesthood of God, and that it is important for all Christians to benefit from the keys that have been established, that we can, in fact, in our church, directly trace back to Jesus Christ for our salvation. And I say this in Jesus' name, amen. So we'll now, we've got a few minutes. If somebody has any questions or comments, just either raise hand or make a notion in the chat, and David will put you on.
I had a question, Jim.
Yeah.
Regarding Catholicism and how they trace their priesthood. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts or opinions about that, like, and why and where we consider it lost. Because Peter, right, definitely had it. And I would suppose that John did following him. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is the issue of the apostasy. In other words, there was two issues really. One is that the Catholic claim is that the succession of the apostles came through the person who was the Bishop of Rome. But that's nowhere provided for in the New Testament. And so that's a leap to say that whoever just happened to be the church leader in Rome, that's the person that is the head of the church. Secondly, of course, you have the apostasy, which is that the priesthood authority was lost. And therefore, although there was a continuous succession of people who were the Bishop of Rome claiming this authority, that they had lost that authority through not following the priesthood and through not having the proper following the proper doctrines of the priesthood.
Thanks. But it is interesting to point out that, like, Catholics will make the same claim.
Yes, and there is definitely, and Catholics recognize this. You know, you can find Catholic theologians who will say the Protestants have no claim. It's you know, either the Mormons or the Catholics. You know, if we, you know, manage to hold on to it through the bishops of Rome, then we've got it. If it was lost, then the Mormons have a perfectly reasonable argument that God put him back on earth the way they said that it happened. And it's interestingly, although the early members of the church inherited this intense anti-Catholicism from their Protestant forebears, people like Joseph Smith and Brigham Young kind of recognized this situation they were in. And there's comments you can find from both Brigham Young and Joseph Smith saying, you know, maybe the Catholics, you know, they're not so bad. We shouldn't hate them like we do. And that was a strong, you know, statement to come from people like Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, who came from these hardcore New England Puritan, you know, extremist Protestant backgrounds. So I see somebody popped up, said they had a question in the
Hi,
chat.
this is Jesse Houchins. So I am curious about when we are tracing the priesthood, where exactly, like, when do we say that Oliver Cowdery, Joseph Smith got the priesthood versus the 1835 organization of the church and like the establishment? Because the apostles, if I remember correctly, were part of one of the high councils before they were apostles. And so they had priesthood. But yeah, I didn't know how that lineage or how that timeline plays out, if you remember that.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. We have very specific information about when and where the Aaronic priesthood was restored. And that's why there's you know, a church visitor center there in Pennsylvania where it happened. We do not have such precise information about where Peter, James, and John visited Joseph and Oliver to ordain them as apostles. It's referred to in sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, but we actually do not have any real precise record that says it was X date at Y location. It's just one of those things that for some reason just wasn't rigorously recorded. It was just alluded to in sections of the Doctrine and Covenants later. And, you know, Joseph and Oliver said it happened. So it's not like people invented this or just guessed at it. You know, Joseph and Oliver both testified that this happened to them, but they didn't leave us with a revelation in the Doctrine and Covenants saying that it happened like there is with the Aaronic priesthood, or specifics as to when and where.
Great. Thank you. No, that's helpful.
Okay. We have any other questions or comments? I mean, if we were in a live class, I would ask for a show of hands as to how many people actually had their line of authority, but we not in a live class, so we can't see, and I can't pick on somebody and say, hey, do you have anything interesting in your line of authority? So I'll ask the question here. We'll ask a question. Does anybody have anything interesting in their line of authority that, I mean, I'm cheating because not only did I research mine in advance, but I also happen to have all this information about New York stake history that is, you know, a peculiar project that I've been involved in for a long time. So I kind of, and also mine's shorter than most people because I go back through those Joseph Fielding Smiths who like leap over decades and decades each, between the two of them. So there are other people may have much longer lines of authority than I do, so makes it for a longer story.
I will say that though I don't remember my line of authority exactly, it is something that many missionaries are encouraged to take with them on their missions.
Oh, okay.
Refer to. I think it's probably cultural that we do that, but I do know many missionaries who had that, like in their Book of Mormon at the beginning, like this is who I received the priesthood from, and this is why I'm allowed to do this, which I think is a cool idea.
Yeah, I think it is also. Hello, Bishop President Nixon's waving at us.
I think it's significant to talk about line of authority, that it comes down, and each of us has that line of authority that comes down. Last night we were at a missionary discussion with the sisters, and as we were talking about it, I was able to go back and directly state who I received the priesthood all the way back to Peter, James, and John, who received it from Jesus Christ. But that we can't activate that authority without having the keys directed by the individual bishops or by the individual local leaders who are given those keys. So I talked about the line of authority that came down for me to have the priesthood office. But I also said that our current Bishop Todd, received the authority and the authorization to exercise those keys because President Nelson called the bishop through President Cropper. And so there's that dual approach that though we have the authority, we can't utilize that authority unless we're directed by keys. So I thought that was interesting too.
Yeah, or in the temple. Somebody,
correct.
Somebody.
President Irene set me apart as the temple president, and the sealing authority goes from different temple to different temple. Though you receive the sealing authority conferral, you can't do it unless you have been directed which temple you can do that sealing authority at. So it all comes under the keys of the current president of the church.
Okay, and that's why I think it's interesting that in Matthew, when Jesus, calls Peter to be the first president of the church, or sets up the program whereby he will succeed as the first president of the church, the thing he talks about is that you will have the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And what are those keys that Jesus refers to? Matthew 16:19 is what you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and what you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven, which is the keys of the sealing power. So that's an illustration of one of the keys, if you will, that the president of the church holds and then delegates, as you described, to other people.
It's interesting. They tell temple presidents that your keys are only for temple work done inside the temple, but the keys for temple work to be done in a stake are under the authority of the stake president or under the authority of the bishop. So we have the authority to perform the ordinances, but the temple work direction comes under those keys, and they differentiate those two.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to make a quick point. In my reading this week, I was reading about how Protestant religions at the time really drew their authority from the Bible.
Right.
And that's kind of how Joseph could believe that he had personally been called of God. His authority came from reading the Bible and acting on that. And I thought it was a really beautiful principle of kind of that idea of, we prove contraries so often in our church, that Joseph could be, could go and pray and knew he had authority to do that, and that God answered him, and that gave him authority, because that Protestant idea of, my authority comes from the direct word of God, and then heaven, that is true. And also, you need direct authority and you need keys. And I just really loved that picture of the two.
Well, it's actually an interesting blend, because in Catholicism, they have the idea of priesthood authority, but the priesthood is separate from the laity. It's not, it's only certain people who are the priests, and they are a very distinct class of people from the general membership of the church. In Protestantism, their belief is it's called the priesthood of all believers. So they say, oh, no, it's not you popes and papists and priests that have the authority. As you said, the Protestant idea was very much that it's the priesthood, all believers have the priesthood. And of course, but that of course then creates a situation where you have no organization, you have no direction, and everybody goes off in their own thing. So in our church, we kind of, I'd like to think we have the best of both worlds. We have an organized priesthood, but it's a priesthood that everyone holds. In other words, that not all men are ordained to the priesthood, so there's no distinction between the clergy and the laity. And as I read those quotes from Presidents Oakes and Ballard, sisters participate in the priesthood also. So we hopefully, kind of have, as I said, the best of both worlds, where we have an organization to effective priesthood, but we also let that priesthood be available to all the believers and not just a special class of people. So thank you for your comment, though, because that is a very, I think, telling point.
We also have a clearer picture of the eternities, and every member having the priesthood and being able to use it just within certain keys makes a lot more sense in the eternal view that we have, which I think is really cool. So
Yeah.
Best of both worlds, but also like a representation of how we believe it should be and will be.
Mm-hmm. Right, of course, because the real eternal vision, of course, is that the church goes away, and we live under the family system, where the families are presided over by a priest and a priestess, and they're in the eternities. There is no church. There's just the sealed family units. Do we have any other comments or questions? All right. So I'll just mention, we'll give everybody one more minute if they want to make any questions or comments. But for those of you who don't, you can get the priesthood line of authority now by going to your church membership. You're on the church website, and there's some instructions there that you just send them an email and they'll send it. There's some rules. You can't just get anybody's line of authority, but they're it's just, like I said, it's just send them an email, and they seem to turn around very quickly. So that's just as far as the mechanics go. Okay, shall we, any other questions, comments? Should we close?
Yeah, we're just looking for anyone for a volunteer prayer to close.
another advantage of being in an in-person class is that you can kind of point somebody out and say,
Okay, I'll say it then.
okay, thank you, President Nixon.
Our Father in heaven, we're grateful for the love and kindness that thou hast given to us in our lives. We're thankful for Jesus Christ and his atonement, his coming to the earth, his putting his church on the earth with priesthood power and priesthood keys that helps us have joy and happiness in our lives. We're thankful for this wonderful lesson on the priesthood by Brother Lucas and for all the good work that he does. We thank thee again for everything that thou hast given to us, and help us to be prepared to act according to thy will. We say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Okay, David, I guess we all leave, and the Sunday school class in another 2 weeks, right?